Welcome back, everyone, after a nice cup of tea. And I'd like to welcome you now to our panel discussion on wildflower seed mixes, should they contain only native species. And I'm Sandy Knapp, and I'm a member of the BSBI trustees, and I'm also a botanist from the Natural History Museum. So I'll be chairing the panel, and our three speakers today are Dr. Kevin Walker, who's the head of science at the BSBI, and he will give a bit of an overview and summarize the pros and cons. And then we'll have two speakers, one speaking for only native taxa and one speaking against only native taxa. Our for native taxa speaker is Sophie Leguil from More Than Weeds, she's a freelance botanical consultant. Our against only native taxa speaker is Oli Pescott, who's a Center for Ecology and Hydrology ecologist, but sits on the BSBI Records and Research Committee. But here he's speaking as an individual. He's debating as an individual. So strip him of his institutional affiliations. And then we'll have a kind of a final comment from Rob Saunders, who will tell us a bit about the Australian Native Strips project. So I'd just like to kind of lay out a few ground rules for my panelists this afternoon. And I'd like to say that you each will be given about 5 minutes and kind of be more or less on time. Or if you go too much over time, I'll just butt in and cut you off. And if you want to speak during the question and answer after Rob's small talk, then please raise your hand like this instead of using the raised hand thing on Zoom, because there's sometimes a lag in that, and that makes it really difficult to kind of figure out when anybody really wants to speak. So after everyone's finished speaking, we'll have a bit of a discussion and Q&A. So please, members of the audience, put any of your questions and you can direct them to an individual or to all four of the people on the panel. And we'll do that, and then I'll supposedly summarize, but actually it's probably going to be very hard. So I'll do a very bad job, but I'll try my best. And then we'll end the panel discussion. So I would like to start out by welcoming Kevin to give his overview of the pros and cons. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Sandy. I'll just share my screen. Okay, thank you, Sandy, and welcome everyone to this discussion session on wildflower seed sowing, and specifically, should we only be sowing seeds of native species? So as Sandy said, I'm the head of science at BSBI, but in a former life, I was a research scientist at the Center for Ecology and Hydrology. And I spent probably about a decade researching techniques, using seed sowing to try and recreate and restore species-rich, particularly grasslands and heathlands. So I've had a long interest in this sort of topic. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is just give you a very brief overview of seed sowing in the UK and just say a little bit about why I think it's important for botanists to be debating it and also thinking about it, probably a bit more harder than we have done in the past. Okay, so the question really is, do we want to recreate wildlife-rich habitats that look a bit like this? So this is just some grasslands that's been recreated on some road verges, and they've used seed of native species. So we've got a nice mixture of natives like buttercups, red clover, box-eye daisy. There's probably a bit of common sorrel in there, and native grasses like red fescue and sweet vernal grass. Or do we want to be a bit more relaxed about where these species come from? So here we've got a similar type of sowing. So the recreation of a habitat on a roadside, but basically this is the seed mixture is basically of mainly cornfield weeds that have come from all around the world. So essentially we're trying to recreate a habitat that's hopefully of some value to wildlife, but we're not that worried about where the species have come from. So in these mixtures you can see they're mainly cornfield annuals. So the main one there, the sort of yellowy one, is Californian poppy from North America. But we've also got some mixtures of corn cockle, corn flower, probably some corn marigold, and poppies and other things as well. So we've got a real mix of things from all over the world. And this debate really came to a head earlier this year. For those of you on Twitter, you were probably aware of the little spat between Chris Packham and what he termed the angry botanists. And essentially he was applauding this wildflower mix that had been sown on a road verge in Musselburgh in Fife. And it wasn't long before most of the botanists on Twitter started to say, well, hang on a minute, these aren't wildflowers, these have come from other parts of the world. And they sort of started to question the value of these sorts of habitats for wildlife. Chris Packham didn't really he didn't really like this, and he accused us of being angry, being pedants, not seeing the bigger picture, which I think it was quite a nuanced debate, but he sort of polarized it quite quickly. But I think in this discussion, I just wanted to make it clear that there are lots of different types of wildflower sowing, and I've just sort of broken them down into the sort of two main types. So we probably have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of tons of wildflower seed being sown all over the UK every year. And they're mainly for these two reasons. Firstly, for what I'd call amenity plantings. So a bit like the Fife roundabout. So these are often where we're just trying to create some wildflower rich habitats in areas, urban areas, where there probably isn't much habitat of wildlife value there before we start. So they're often in sort of urban green spaces, so road verges, ex-industrial land, things like that. And then the second main sort of use of seed sowing is in habitat recreation. And this is probably on a much bigger scale. It's often associated with big landscaping projects, so big civil engineering projects such as new road, rail, housing developments, when we're trying to restore ex-industrial land or ex-mining land. So we often see these are the sort of communities we see sort of around us, following these big civil engineering projects. And then finally, we've got what I would call habitat recreation on agricultural land, where we're trying to restore habitats of wildlife value, often on ex-arable land, but also as strips on the edges of cultivated fields. Okay, so just to finish off, why do I think it matters? Why do I think it matters that we should debate this thing? And I've got really, there's 5 main reasons, and I hope that we're going to touch on this a bit more in the discussion. But firstly, whether we're introducing natives or non-natives, we're sort of affecting the distributions of species, even globally or nationally. And I've been doing a lot of work trying to sort out the maps for Atlas 2000, and this creates a huge headache, particularly for native species where we're introducing things outside of their native distribution. So it can undermine the sort of biogeography of these species. Particularly for native species as well, we're often introducing novel genotypes. So they may be native species, but they've probably come from other parts of Europe even, or other parts of Britain. And then that can disrupt the sort of genetic, the sort of population genetics of species locally. And obviously that can affect ecological function, particularly if these novel genotypes have slightly different phenologies or different biochemistries. And that can have effects on, associated insects. Fourthly, there's a question about management. So if we just recreate things with annual mixes, they're only there for a year. After a year, all the benefits have gone, so we have to start again. Whereas if we're recreating perennial grassland communities, for instance, they have much longer term benefits, and they will mature and be dynamic, they're much more permanent. And then finally, and possibly most importantly, there's a sort of cultural and aesthetic importance to all this. And I think that was at the heart of the Chris Packham spat on Twitter. As botanists, we really want to see the species and habitats that we have lost put back into the environment, whether that's urban or in the wider countryside. And that's very important to us. So we will be pedantic about whether it's a native or a non-native species. But I think the general public are just more interested in whether these things look nice, regardless of the sort of overall value in terms of wildlife. Okay, so that was all I wanted to say. So I'll just hand back to Sandy and on to the next speaker.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. That was a really nice overview. So I'd now like to invite Sophie to put the case for only native taxa. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. I think to me, the first question to ask is, why are we sowing these wildflower meadows? Is it for the aesthetics, or is it to really recreate, functional habitats with biodiversity benefits? So if I put my, ecological hat on, I would really struggle to find a case for non-native species. And one of the first reason I would say really is if we want to recreate a functional habitat for insects, really native species are best. And the reason for that is that, for example, if you look at many caterpillars, moth caterpillars, for example, they require very specific native wildflowers. And to me, potentially looking at the impact of non-native, we are creating flower-rich meadows or meadow-like arrangements. But are we not selecting for specific insects, i.e. pollinators? We always talk about, creating those non-native meadows with an impact on increasing the resource for pollinators. But are we not selecting also our insect life and our invertebrates as a result, because they have very specific function? Are we not depriving ourselves of potentially a whole area of biodiversity which relies on the other function of plants? So, for example, the leaves and the roots of many wildflowers. I think the second argument I would like to introduce for natives is the invasive risk. I mean, we've had a couple of talks this morning about the invasive risk of some plant escaping from gardens. And when you look at many of the non-native arrangements, they may look quite harmless for now. But do we have an idea of what those may have as an impact in the future, particularly when they are sown in non-urban environments? For example, the California poppy, which was, I think, Kevin, you showed in your earlier slide, is starting to be considered as an invasive or a plant with an invasive potential in France. And with climate change, can we be sure that those non-natives that we introduce are going to have an impact, or they're not going to have an impact on the local ecosystem? And what I mean by that is both native flowers and also the rest of our biodiversity. And finally, and I think this is possibly the argument that was made quite a lot on Twitter, and I think it's potentially one of the most important, because it touches on our relationship with nature, and it's an engagement one. So we despair a lot of the time about the decline of nature, the decline of biodiversity in the UK, and the need to green our spaces. But I mean, the use of non-native, is it really helping the general public, councils, to discover the diversity of native plants in the UK, and also to understand what a functional habitat is? When we are recreating those colorful mixes of seeds, are we somehow painting by numbers? Is a comparison that is often used. It's very pretty, it's very colorful, but actually, are we really engaging people with nature? Are we just recreating a sort of Victorian type of bedding? And finally, and this is an argument which I think it needs to be mentioned, is the impact on mental health. So we heard from some of the other speakers about the impact of plants on our mental health. And for example, there are studies that show that a native meadow will have really subtle touches of color. And if we look at some of the non-native seed mixes, they tend to be quite maximizing the amount of color that you see, and potentially that can have a counterproductive effect on our mental health. So it looks pretty, but it also makes us feel overwhelmed. So I think it's it needs to be said, particularly when those seed mixes are becoming popular. They're being requested by the public to their local councils. And I think it's an important element alongside all the ecological and scientific arguments.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And I am so impressed that you guys have been able to keep so well to time. So I'd like to invite Oli now to put the case against only native taxa. Oli, are you there?
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the two main principles important for this debate are firstly, clearly acknowledging what the main objectives are for any given location. And secondly, being clear which of our preferences relate to these and which relate to extraneous personal or community-based value judgments. So if we're talking about urban areas of different types, then we will very likely be considering very different approaches to if we were working to restore habitats in the wider countryside. In urban areas, as we've heard, there's often a preference for planting schemes that available evidence suggests are most attractive to the widest range of people, and which often use non-natives to increase diversity of colour, of structure, climatic resilience, etc. And this is just as the University of Sheffield Department of Landscape Architecture have been doing very successfully with great popular success for a number of years, such as we probably all remember at the London Olympics in 2012. However, I think we cannot make much progress on agreeing locally appropriate solutions if we start out from the position that non-natives or foreign source seed or even anthropogenic communities for that matter are somehow intrinsically bad. Nothing is intrinsically bad or good in nature without humans labeling it so. And humans label things based on personal values and communal cultures, that is, on sets of shared assumptions. I mean, of course, facts will inform these positions, but as David Hume pointed out in the early 18th century, you cannot coherently move from descriptive to prescriptive positions without invoking values of some sort. And as my predecessor at BRC, Chris Preston, has pointed out several times in the literature, the labels native, non-native are descriptive ones about movement pathways, not prescriptive ones about how a landscape should look or be. And once we make that jump from facts to value judgments, we tend to start to selectively present the facts and inevitably therefore choosing those that fit our arguments and ignoring others that might be inconvenient or less clear cut. For example, and Kevin touched on this, we do not really know nearly enough about the relative likelihoods of what might be called the positive benefits of genetic rescue or increasing genetic adaptation through introductions of non-natives versus the negative consequences of outbreeding depression. We don't know enough about this topic, broadly speaking, to be able to make general statements about whether the introduction of non-native genotypes is going to be good or bad for any particular native population. It's just an incredibly complex topic, and it depends on the species considered, the populations used, the different environments in which the genotypes might interact, and the timescale over which the question of any resulting changes from that introduction might actually be considered. In the longer term, it might lead to speciation, which has happened in Britain, obviously, with things like Mimulus and Senecio, and there are other examples from all around the world. And likewise, the question of the use of non-native plants by invertebrates is bedeviled by the detail. I mean, which invertebrates, what uses, how related are the non-native plants to the native plants? Is the number of invertebrate species intrinsically better than some diversity metric that captures community uniqueness or variation across the landscape, or simple abundance measures? Which non-native plants and invertebrates are considered in the experiment or survey that's being claimed as evidence to support a certain position? Are databases of invertebrate plant interactions used to support this actually complete, or rather more likely, are they in fact highly skewed towards our knowledge of native associations? So really, to conclude, my message is that failing to distinguish between facts and values in this area generally leads to messages that seek to convince others of a value-based position, rather than acknowledging and clearly explaining uncertainty in the evidence base, which is always present, as all scientists know, and the fact that values that are not shared between groups can still very much be sincerely held and very reasonable on both sides of the debate. And choosing only the parts of the science that seem to support our values in order to convince is neither a very fair use of science, nor a really honest approach to managing a whole landscape for the benefit of everybody in a society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oli. I'm just so impressed with the way you all are able to keep to time, much better than I could ever do. So I'm going to now pass to Rob, who's going to tell us about an example from Australia about using native strips. Rob, are you there? So this is not Rob Saunders. This is Steve Gator, who's pretending to be Rob Saunders.
I don't think I'm a very good lookalike, but I'm here, and I'll tell you why I'm here. I'm here to present some information from halfway around the world, which Rob was going to present himself. But when he realized that in order to get a good internet connection for this Zoom conference, he would have to displace the rest of his household, he had second thoughts. And since it's 2:20 Sunday morning, I think that's the right decision that he took.
Fair enough.
So I have his information, and I hope that you've managed to see his exhibition, which is top of the list, Rob Saunders, because it's very, very informative. There are videos there, and it tells you what they're doing in Melbourne. Rob is a resident of Melbourne, and he's a volunteer at the Bayside City Community Nursery. That's in the southeast part of the city. And I know the nursery because I visited it when I was with my daughter in February of this year, and I volunteered there for a day, and it's a fascinating place. Rob notes that the interest in Australian plants, similar to here, is going through a very serious resurgence in popularity at the moment. And some of the leading garden designers, artists, and landscape architects have been very creative with native and indigenous species. And as any visitor to Australia knows, the borders are very strict on biosecurity screening. Bayside as an area has about 430 indigenous plant species, mostly woodland, heathland, and wetland plants. There's great variation in growing requirements, but many are adapted to dry conditions and even more can take dry spells, and of course survive bushfires. And this time last year was a bit serious. About half of those plants remain, and most of those are propagated in the community nursery run by the council. And that's the theme of Rob's exhibition. He's focusing on nature strips. The facts are that about a third of all public green space in Melbourne is nature strips. About a quarter of residential properties have some form of nature strip gardening. So what is a nature strip? Well, basically it's a narrow patch of land. It's equivalent to a road verge, but the difference is that it's public land that private citizens are required by law to maintain. The local councils all have bylaws governing how the nature strips should be planted and where. And Bayside Community Nursery raises plants either from propagation or seeds to sell cheaply to residents to plant and grow in their nature strips. The residents can't simply do what they want, they have to follow a plan, but they're given advice, they're given guidance, they're given outline planning designs, and they're encouraged to attend talks, to attend workshops, and more than that, to volunteer to raise the plants in the first place, which is how I got to know about the scheme. The overall messages of from the council to the community are that, first of all, nature strips are an important wildlife resource, that you can actually reduce the time needed to maintain, which is generally mowing your nature strip with a little bit of effort and thought, and that engaging everyone is key to success, as is the focus on planting native and indigenous species. So when I was preparing Rob to be here and present, I asked him a very direct question. Do you advocate planting natives or non-natives? Could you give me a blunt reply? And this is part of his response. Rob says, I think my answer would have to be nuanced a bit, more grey than black and white. As an ecologist, I support the increasing use of locally indigenous species, particularly in nature strips. Indigenous species have the best chance of surviving and contributing to the habitat values of an area because they've evolved in situ and are adapted to the area. They tend to use less water and need less maintenance. They also tend to attract beneficial insects and birds. Having said that, I also actively support the retention of healthy, mature canopy trees of all kinds on development sites. Large canopy trees make a significant contribution to ecosystem services, such as the removal of pollutants from the air, circulation of water by transpiration, and the provision of shade, reducing the urban heat island effect, and many other benefits. As a garden designer in private gardens, I respect the wishes of owners. Essentially, a private garden is a compromise. Well, I've had to cut short what Rob would say, so apologies for that, Rob. But I'll end with an iteration of this final comment. Essentially, a private garden is a compromise. Isn't that the same for public spaces? wilder habitats.
Thank you very much, Steve, for a very eloquent kind of pretending to be Rob Saunders. That was really great. So we are now going to have a session of questions and answers, and we've had a lot of comments. There's a lot of comments, so I'm going to try to focus this on the questions that there are for the panel rather than the comments at the minute. So if you've made comments, they're in there, but I'll come to them more towards the end. And what I'd like to say is I'll address these to kind of specific panelists, but if other panelists want to chip in, please kind of raise your hand and tell me that you want to say something. So the first comment is to say, Kevin, we're so sorry, but that Musselburgh is in East Lothian and not in Fife. I probably wouldn't have known that. But anyway, so here's a question for Oli from Jonathan Shanklin, and he says, are counties or countries, I'm not sure if it's countries or counties, that try to suppress the introduction of any alien species misguided?
I think, I presume you meant countries. I love this question from Jonathan because Jonathan's worked on projects with me on horizon scanning for future invasive species that might threaten particular countries. So it's a nice loaded question from Jonathan there.
Sorry, Jonathan.
No, I don't think they're misguided. I think as I laid out in my talk, it's important to decide on communal values and what a society wants to achieve when it comes to biosecurity. So of course, on the one hand, that might be stopping certain noxious weeds coming in and affecting agriculture, or it might be, as we heard this morning, planting things which are very likely to escape from gardens. So I think it's ultimately a question of societal values and decision making, and those horizon scanning exercises are, I think, designed to provide information to policymakers, not to actually do the banning themselves. So it's about providing the evidence base on which politicians and other people supporting those politicians can come to those decisions, which are decided at the society level. It's a compromise, as Steve pointed out.
As are many things in life, aren't they? Does Sophie, do you want to respond to that question? I think you'd probably say yes.
Well, I think it's a difficult point. I mean, if I look at my personal experience, France, for example, has a completely, a slightly different approach to non-native invasives. In that, for example, Japanese knotweed is being controlled rather than being eradicated. And they're accepting that in some areas they will have to leave them to grow because there's not enough resource. So there has been like a selection process to try and find areas of high sensitivity and low sensitivity. So I think each country is obviously having its own. I think I agree in some way with Oli and what he says about values. It's about each country deciding what is more important for them and where they place the value.
Yeah. And this is one for all of you, and I'll start with Kevin because he hasn't spoken on this last question. Is how do you respond to the wildflower seeding by National Wildflower Centre in post-industrial spaces in Liverpool and neighbouring authorities? Do you have Kevin? Why don't you address that first?
I think this goes back to Oli's point about context. I mean, I think in those areas there probably wasn't an awful lot of wildlife habitat present. There was a lot of derelict land. It was there's very little soil. In fact, they had to sort of introduce soil to actually grow some of this stuff. So, and I think it had a very positive effect for the local community. I think my only caveat is that I think urban, certainly brownfield sites, can be very important for biodiversity, and we shouldn't undervalue their importance as a habitat per se. We sort of get fixated with our priority habitats, species-rich grasslands, woodlands and things. But I think we should sort of embrace some of these sort of novel habitats that are sort of assembling in these very, very harsh environments within urban areas. And certainly in London, we have now communities that probably don't exist anywhere else in the world because we brought species from all over the world. They've escaped from gardens. They've found these very harsh environments and they've colonized them and done extremely well. The likelihood those species will invade what we could perceive to be other habitats of importance is very low because they're adapted to very different conditions and they're only found in those sorts of places. So, I'm sort of copping out a little bit and just saying it's context specific.
Okay, but I expect Ollie, you'd probably say more or less the same thing.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, really. I agree with Kevin's points.
And Sophie?
Yeah, I agree with Kevin as well. I think he's right in pointing out, that brownfield is very important. It's undervalued. I think, it goes back to my point about engagement, because those areas tend to be, we have an unconscious bias against those places. But I think it's when you talk about brownfield, there are obviously non-natives in there. But are they more acceptable or less acceptable than non-natives that we have chosen to plant? It's a question.
Yeah, that's interesting. And this links into a comment which was made very early on in the questions and answers as people were speaking, from Mark Spencer, who said that actually some of these, that it's disturbing to see these urban sort of brownfield sites be thought of as being low value, because they often contain important things like lizard orchids and other things which get crowded out by sometimes planting the wildflower mixes. So that was just a comment from Mark early on. So Joe Mallion is asking, is there a chance that by encouraging the public to fall in love with non-native flower species by planting them in urban areas where a high proportion of our population lives, including a majority of young people, that we will over time lose the love and therefore the desire to learn about our native flowers? Sophie, why don't you address that first?
I think it's a very important point. Certainly, over the past few years, we've seen more local authorities, planting non-native seed mixes on roundabouts, and even native seed mix, but that are artificial in the way the plants are put together. They wouldn't grow naturally together in the wild, even as native plants. And certainly, the response that we've seen on to newspaper articles, on social media, many people have said, can we have this, in our neighborhoods? Can we have this? They've been asking, their councils to plant those plants, and there have actually been comments, which I've seen people saying, oh, this looks so much nicer than our boring road verges. And somehow, to me, this is a problem, because it means that we are changing people's perception potentially of what a road verge should look like, and what a native habitat should look like. And I think it's potentially a worry for the future, especially, as I was saying, in my talk, that we are trying to engage people more with nature, trying to make people connect with nature. But if we change what nature looks like, then how are we kind of losing that connection?
Okay, I'd just like to make a comment there from my point of view is nature looks like what it looks like now, but it hasn't always looked like that. Nature changes all the time too. So I'll pass to either Oli or Kevin, whoever wants to speak first, for this question about losing the desire to learn about native plants.
Yeah, I'll go first, and maybe, sorry,
Okay.
as a
Ollie,
kind of polar opposite to Sophie, and then Kevin can come in. Yeah, I think this is very much a loaded question. We don't go around asking ourselves whether non-native trees in urban parks or in our shrubs in our gardens or flower beds corrupt our understanding of nature. I got interested in botany and became an ecologist through gaining an interest in non-native trees in parks. And that led me to discover everything I now know about nature, whether that's about native communities or non-native communities. So I think it's a very strange point of view. It's kind of like the noble savage argument, where there's some sort of, the only way of learning is through some sort of pure romantic experience of something which is not really a thing in reality. It's in our minds. And I don't think that's useful for humans' relations with nature in general. It kind of sets us apart from what is actually outside that we can step out and experience on our doorstep. I think it's actually putting up a block between nature and humans. And so I don't really see any logical need for that type of association between nativeness and knowledge. It's a false dichotomy. We can learn by experiencing what's there and understanding it.
Okay, Kevin, do you have something to add to that?
It's just a sort of broader question about, well, it's a broader point about the sorts of habitats that we're sort of trying to encourage, say, within an urban green space. And I agree with Ollie. I think that there's intrinsic value in all types of vegetation, however it's sort of assembled. But I do think there is quite a lot of native, for want of a better word, habitats in our urban sort of green spaces, and lockdown has shown certainly where I live, there's been virtually no cutting of road verges or urban green spaces for about 2 or 3 months. And there was an amazing amount of diversity emerged from that. And people were engaged with it. You know, they just didn't know it was there. And as soon as they realized it was there, you know, it had great value. And those places probably still have a lot of value because people have suddenly seen that these things that were billiard tables, you know, for the last 10 years have got things like bee orchids or even, you know, buttercups and things like that growing on their own doorstep. So maybe the other question is, should we not be promoting that more when we're talking to councils to try and just manage the habitats that we have got, that people just don't know are there as well?
Yeah, you're talking to a person who does her New Year's plant hunt along the canals in London every single year. So basically, I just look at urban, native, and mixture non-native plants. There's a sort of related question about about people getting used to these bright and colorful non-native plantings labeled as wildflower meadows. Will people expect to see that in the countryside? So is there a risk of having the context-dependent thing of having these in the cities, in urban areas, but then people expecting that is actually what our native flora should look like? What do you think about the relative risks of that? And since you're there, Kevin, why don't you go first?
I do think there is a risk that we sort of increase people's expectations too high in terms of how colourful our sort of really unique and precious habitats that, you know, have evolved over, you know, 10,000 years since the end of the last glaciation. So, you know, I'm a sort of sedge fan, but it's very hard to get people into sedges. You know, if you're putting a sedge up against, I don't know, Californian poppy, there is no real, you know, on the aesthetics states that, you know, just from a pure visual color impact, there's no comparison. So I do worry a little bit that we are creating a sort of, you know, a raised expectation about how lacking in color our native habitats can be.
Yeah. I mean, mind you, I think this is probably the cue for us to do another poll about sedges versus California poppies. But Sophie, would you like to respond to that about expectation management?
I think it's a very valid point. And, you know, I was mentioning reading newspaper comments and things like that. And certainly it's something that, you know, I see filtering through more and more. People asking, you know, why don't we replace, you know, those verges by something that is more colorful? And I think it's potentially a worry, not necessarily about the diversity itself, but about, you know, the expectation of what nature should look like. And somehow my kind of worry is also about, you know, the fact that we seem to accept those planted, you know, those kind of deliberately planted environments more than an environment that has been left to grow. So you'll have people in those cities complaining about the grass being left to grow in their local park, but commenting on how lovely that roundabout with, you know, an arable seed mix looks. And I think to me that kind of duality is potentially quite dangerous, and we have to be careful that we don't change people's perception of nature completely. I think it's potentially more of a problem in small towns where you have an interface between an urban environment and a countryside environment, you know, where it kind of fades quite gradually into one and in the other. That I think that it's potentially quite dangerous in those places.
Okay, thanks. Oli, do you have anything to add to this particular point? This has been brought up by quite a number of people in the comments.
Yeah, I think it betrays a very strange anxiety about the countryside and how we experience nature. There are numerous wonderful, colourful displays in our countryside: heather in the uplands, bell heather and western gorse in the southwest of England, beech trees in the autumn in the Chilterns. I find it a strange argument to make that, you know, Californian poppy is somehow more intense and potent than any of those scenes. And from that point of view, I think it's a false argument. I can't see that there's a distinction between encouraging people to appreciate vegetation in urban areas or on roundabouts with colourful displays, and then somehow thinking that desensitizing them to the wonderful displays that we have elsewhere in the countryside, as if those people are somehow so stupid that they can only respond to something like a palette, a simple color palette, and can't appreciate other aspects of scenery, of diversity, of structure, of form, and all these other things that people have responded to artistically and culturally for the whole of human evolution. I mean, again, also in other countries, there are native elements of their flora, such as cherry blossom in Japan, where they occur throughout the countryside, but also certain hillsides, certain forests, certain mountains have also been selectively cultivated so that cherry trees dominate the scene, and then in urban parks have been planted in large areas and are now celebrated every year in cherry blossom festivals. I mean, is that some corruption in the other way? Has nature corrupted humans there to appreciate a certain type of scenery? I think it's a very odd argument that portrays an anxiety of conservationists rather than anything intrinsic to how people respond to nature and color and other types of things which give us pleasure.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly kind of say something which has come in from Louise over Twitter, which I think before I lose it in the chat, which kind of goes up and then I well, I just lose things. Dawn, who's attending from Canada, has set up a Twitter poll about this. So I'm sure that Louise has retweeted this. So those of you on Twitter, have a look. And she makes the point that it's really interesting that we should be aiming to source local native, quote unquote, indigenous seeds because it supports local businesses. So there's a kind of business argument to having natives in these kinds of areas as well. So does anybody want to comment on
Sandy,
that? You're there,
Sandy, can I comment on that?
Yes, do that.
Because the experience half the world away is that a council is raising native plants to sell directly to the public and to sell to garden centres to sell to the public. So, and if you have a look at the video, Rob takes you into the nursery and there's nothing there. It's all been sold. Of course, it's the end of the season now, so that the plants have gone. In other words, it's not about minimizing the business opportunities. It's actually about maximizing it.
No, but I think that's what Dawn is saying.
Yeah, it's about engaging the residents in looking at what's growing in front of their houses and appreciating it. And then wherever they wander, appreciating even more what they see in the wild, wherever that wilderness is. But the wilderness is in front of their garden if they choose to tend a nature strip or its equivalent.
Thanks. Anybody else want to weigh in on the business opportunity area? Kevin.
Just from a seed supply perspective, that there is an element of cost to all this, and most of the seed that you will buy in this country comes from a very few seed companies, and the majority of those will just import seed from other countries and basically import it at very low cost. And it's much cheaper to do that than it is to grow native provenance seed and grow it here and bulk it up over time. And so there is a whole cost element to this. It is much more expensive to source local seed. And I think there's just an overwhelming supply of cheap seed, which just unfortunately is the sort of stuff that we find in all the garden centres and in the supermarkets.
I agree with you, Kevin, on that. It's really the I sometimes get asked, where can I source native seeds, and it's not necessarily easy. A lot of the time there's a small quantities, so they get sold out and things like that. So I think it's definitely potentially one of the reasons why councils and private owners tend to go for the other seed mixes, because they're more available and cheaper. So potentially there is a business case there to increase the production of native seeds and make it easier and more accessible.
Okay, so there's another question here. Unless Oli, do you want to say something about the sort of business opportunities of this, or have we exhausted?
No, just that I think Homo economicus will respond to whatever the case is. So
yeah, probably right. And I was going to ask Kevin if you think there is by sourcing the native seeds and then having native seeds sourced from one place, is there your second issue with this is about genotypes. It's about mixing of genotypes, which are not necessarily from local populations. Is there an issue there?
Yeah, so that's the other argument, that we do have some seed suppliers who will only source native provenance seed. the problem with that is there's only a few of them, and often they don't collect their seed very often. So maybe some of the seed that they're selling off, something like, I don't know, Devil's Bit scabious, was collected at one site in Lincolnshire. And that has been sold all over the country, an extremely narrow genetic base, and it's been sown into sort of, you know, lots of other places throughout the country. But we just don't know how that impacts the local population, whether those genotypes survive, do well. There's very, you know, to pick up on Oli's point, there's hardly any research on this. There are, you know, some very good papers, but they only deal with, you know, 5 or 6 species, and they're only been done in a couple of countries. So there's a huge element of a research need here to understand the sort of impacts of the sort of local genotypes.
Yes, it's also clear from a lot of work going on around the world that there's a lot of genotypic variation and change going on in urban versus rural habitats, even within the same species, that the urban habitat is significantly different. There's another thing I'd like to just mention that people have commented on, is that don't forget, open mosaic habitat on previously developed land is a UK priority habitat.
Yeah.
So it's not, so what many people might think is kind of boring and tedious actually is a priority habitat and is really interesting. So that's just to do on that in that comment. And here's a specific question for Oli, which is this is quite long, so I'm just going to read it, Oli, because I might not get it right. Is to have society, humans, as the one to decide what you would not give another organism, fauna and flora, the same power? Would you not give another organism the same power? There have been quite a lot of studies of nectar source comparisons between native and non-native and cultivars. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but anyway, the invertebrates that are specialist feeders missing to escape their red listed current position. I think the question is sort of about the fact that by not having native plants around, some of these red listed invertebrates don't have the right sort of nectar and leaf sources to complete their life histories properly.
Well, I mean, the debate topic was about only including native species. So obviously I was talking from the point of view of it being okay to include non-native sometimes. And as we said, you know, a lot of this is context specific. Yeah. There's a lot of research on this topic going back to the Biodiversity and Urban Gardens of Sheffield project and the follow-up project that Sheffield did over 5 different cities across the whole of Britain and Ireland, and then a lot of work by the RHS recently, Jennifer Owen's 30-year study of her garden in Leicester. And, you know, yes, it's true that it certainly for some insect native plant combinations, then yes, you need that native plant for that insect, but it's equally true that having a variety of plants, whether native or non-native, can also yield benefits in terms of, you know, whether it's abundance or community uniqueness, or as I think Kevin mentioned earlier about unique anthropogenic communities. And in certain areas, particularly urban areas, post-industrial areas that we've said, you know, there's no reason why that shouldn't be a possibility and shouldn't be something that's valued as well. So yes, you know, we have the whole of the landscape to play with. We're not talking about covering the whole of Britain and Californian poppy. We're talking about locally appropriate solutions, and if that includes taking red listed invertebrates into consideration, then yes, that's clearly something that should be considered.
Mm-hmm. So Sophie,
I think it kind of points out, however, you know, the need for surveying and the need to have a proper baseline, because you know, it's I think the problem sometimes when seed mixes are used in urban environments, you know, you go from amenity grassland, things that have been mown every 2 weeks, to something, you know, that looks colorful with flowers. But what about the potential of that, you know, existing land before it was converted? You know, do we know what it was? Do we have an idea, you know, of what was in that seed bank, and whether, you know, that verge could have been, you know, managed differently and could have yielded different results? You know, so I think it's very important to remind, you know, that the need for surveying and not to have, you know, too much bias on what it looks like, but also to think about what it could look like as with a different management.
Yeah. Okay, there's another comment. It's a comment, but actually I'd like to turn it into a question for all 3 of you. Is Robin Walls is wondering about the scale implicit in labeling something native or non-native, which as a taxonomist, that's something which actually I've thought about quite a lot, is when does a non-native become native, and how how long does it take? And I know this is something that's been quite important in British botany, but I do most of my botany in the Andes, where there's a lot more diversity. But I'd like you, all three of you, to comment on this thing about the scale implicit in this labeling of native versus non-native. Sophie, you've got the floor, so go.
Thank you. I think it's a really difficult question, particularly when you think about, especially in urban environments, but even outside of urban environments. There are, botanists are still arguing whether some plants are native or not native. So I think it gives you an idea of, the scale of the problem. I think really one of the arguments is to think, rather than thinking about native and non-native, is to think about the functional value of a particular species. Is it actually useful to insects? Does it bring something to a particular habitat? In terms of its value, I think we should try to think potentially a bit more about that, rather than necessarily about the nativeness versus non-nativeness.
Kevin.
That's a real curveball question from Robin. Thank you.
I thought so. It wasn't a question. I turned it into one.
I have been doing quite a lot of thinking about this around Atlas 2020, because we have this issue of, are things nationally native or non-native, but also are species that are native in certain parts of Britain, they colonize other parts of Britain, and we say, oh, they're just introduced in there, where they're not native in that part, for instance, say in Scotland. And I think when you sort of think about it, it's all about whether you accept man as a dispersal agent. So the sort of classic, native, non-native argument is if man has been implicated in the spread of a species, then it therefore becomes, and it's moved to an area where it wouldn't have got to on its own, it therefore becomes a non-native, an alien species. But that argument breaks down, particularly within a country, certainly. We've been looking at some species that have been colonizing, they've been moving around, we think, just on the feet of humans. So if you go holidaying in Cornwall, you drive back across to Suffolk or somewhere, and you've got the seed of that species on your feet, and you go and visit Minsmere Nature Reserve and you introduce that species there, is it an alien or is it a native? I mean, I would argue that has dispersed using a natural vector. It's just man has just speeded up the whole process, and if it's done unintentionally and accidentally, then how different is that to it being moved by a fox or a bird? I think it's a really very difficult area, and there's loads of nuance, but that's sort of as far as I've got on it.
Well, there's a lot there. Interestingly, because I work on black nightshades, and there's lots of introduced black nightshades in the UK, and where have they come from? And and there's quite a big literature about how things are dispersed, and a lot of it has to do with looking at people's clothing when they go to Antarctica, and huge numbers of things are taken out of people's clothing when they go to Antarctica because they really don't want things to get to Antarctica, which is, and it just had never really occurred to me about human beings being dispersal agents, which of course we are.
Yeah.
And we're the ultimate weed, aren't we? We're an invasive mammalian weed.
Yeah.
Homo sapiens. Oli, do you have anything?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I mean, going back to the original question, I think it comes down to a facts versus value distinction again. Yes, there is scientific value in asking questions about histories of interactions between gene pools and environmental drivers, and looking at how that interacts with dispersal and new environments. And those are all scientific questions which make those descriptive categories of native, non-native, however defined at whatever scale. Those descriptions may well be very useful and appropriate for a particular scientific study. But as soon as you transplant them into the realm of value judgments, then everything changes, and you are suddenly perhaps making conservation decisions or asking other questions which are although they're based on the same set of considerations, actually have very different implications and are not scientific questions at all, but which are questions about human values. And that's part of the problem about discussing this area, is that people allied the two, frequently slip between one and the other without being clear about where they're coming from. And that creates a lot of confusion and obviously emotion, because part of it is value-based. But yes, ultimately, you know, if you zoom out, what were the lessons of the, you know, the Apollo space missions that were stuck on spaceship Earth? And one of the messages of that is that humans are part of nature. We're all on the same marble floating through space. It's all natural. It's all part of the same continuum. So it depends what questions you're asking and what purposes, what objectives you're trying to achieve, whether they're scientific ones or whether you're trying to convince people of a certain course of action.
Great. I mean, I've let us go way over the time because it's been full of such interesting questions and comments. And I would just like to mention that there's quite a lot of comments coming in, Kevin, which are definitely in support of sedges. So sedges and graminoids are definitely on the list of things that are very good. And there's a lot of comments about, you know, the native and non-native and questions and more comments about, well, one person, Leslie Mason, has said sedges win. But, and I think, you know, that there's a lot of comments, a lot of things from people in Canada about, so this has been a really fantastic discussion. And Louise has asked me to sum up, which is absolutely almost impossible. But I just like to say that I think that some of the things I took from this discussion personally are that actually our focus on insect pollinators, and specifically on bees, to be quite fair, is actually we need to kind of expand our thinking about what insects use plants and how insects use plants. And perhaps BSBI has, even though we're about plants and we're botanists, we may have a role to play in increasing the conversation about how plants support many other types of insect communities than just pollinators. I think Oli's point about fact versus value and about increasing understanding of uncertainty and evidence base and communal values actually has real value of us helping to kind of bring that kind of recognition of uncertainty. I think some of Rob's points about private spaces and what is private are really interesting in this context. The Australian context actually, though, is quite different from the British context as well. Australia has a very ancient native flora. Britain has a native flora, which is extremely young on a global scale. So I would class most things in Britain as non-native anyway. That's slightly kind of controversial in a BSBI sense, but I might as well get everybody mad at me. And I think Kevin's kind of nuanced view of those 5 things of distribution, genotypes, ecological function, management, and aesthetics actually are a way to think about this in a very nuanced way. And I think one of the things that all 4 of the panelists have really brought out in this discussion is that this is not a black and white argument. This is a really nuanced discussion. And I think having that nuanced discussion can be difficult, but actually nuanced discussions are really super important for us to have and super important for us to discuss amongst ourselves, but also with our local councils and people who are around. And I just like to talk a tiny bit, just 1 minute. I have 1 minute. And I just want to say that I think it's really important that we also think about the time frame that we're in right now. We are in now a geological period called the Anthropocene, which is dominated by humans and dominated by human impact. And so we may have habitats which we are creating in the Anthropocene, which don't look like habitats which were there earlier. And we should think about those that perhaps have value as well. And maybe try to think in a bit of a broad-minded way about this. I wouldn't like to see California poppies carpeting the countryside, but I do think that we are in a time frame that evolution is happening very quickly all around us because of climate change and because of the Anthropocene and because of us. And so we have a huge impact on the environment, but we need to think about that in a very thoughtful kind of way. So that's just my view to end up. And I'd just like to thank all 4 of our panelists, Sophie, Oli, Steve being Rob, and Kevin, for really bringing out this discussion and argument, and not arguing, but actually thinking about each other's points of view in a fantastic and super interesting way.